The water container sat on the metal shelf, almost empty. Tom stared at the gauge for what felt like the 100th time that morning. 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if he cut back even more on drinking. Maybe 5 if he stopped washing altogether and let the dust cake onto his skin like armor. He'd been doing the math in his head for months now, watching the numbers get smaller, knowing that one day they'd reach 0. 37 years. That's how long he'd been alone on this planet called Kepler 442b. Sometimes he couldn't believe it. Sometimes he could believe nothing else. The world outside his shelter was red and dead and endless. The sky was always the same shade of brown, the wind always howled the same way, and nothing, absolutely nothing, changed except the slow draining of his water supplies. He walked over to the window, if you could call it that. It was really just a thick piece of reinforced plastic that he'd patched more times than he could count. Outside, the landscape stretched forever. Rocks the size of buildings sat half buried in sand. Strange formations jutted out like bones. And somewhere out there, about 50 kilometers to the south, lay the colony pod. His old home. The place where everyone else had died. Tom didn't like to think about the colony pod much. It held too many memories of people. Of voices. Of a time when he wasn't completely alone. The crash had happened when he was still young, still believing that rescue would come. He'd waited at that pod for 2 years, rationing the food, maintaining the equipment, checking the radio every single day. But rescue never came. The pod started to rust. The equipment failed one system at a time. And eventually Tom realized that the rescue ship must have crashed too. Or it had never been sent. Either way, he was alone. So he'd left. He'd taken what he could carry and walked away from that metal tomb. Better to die trying than to wait in a dead place. For 3.5 decades he'd learned to survive. He'd learned which rocks held water that you could collect after the rare rains. He'd learned which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you in hours. He'd learned to fix things with materials that weren't meant to be fixed. He'd become something harder than human, something that could survive in a place that was designed to kill. But survival was getting harder. The rain came less often. The plants were dying off. And his body, even though his mind stayed sharp, was wearing down like an old machine. He felt it in his joints, in the way his hands shook sometimes when he was tired. He was getting old. And an old man alone on a dead planet doesn't last much longer. The radio had been broken for years. Tom kept it anyway, the same way he kept a lot of useless things. It reminded him that the world outside still existed somewhere. That there were people and ships and civilization, even if he'd never see any of it again. He'd given up trying to fix it after the 15th attempt. Some things just died. But at dawn that morning, something strange happened. The radio crackled. Tom was making breakfast, if you could call it that, just some plant paste mixed with insects that he dried and ground up, when the sound came. It was so sudden that he dropped his bowl. The noise was impossible. He hadn't heard that sound in so long that for a moment, he couldn't even identify what it was. Then his mind caught up. Radio. The radio was on. His heart started beating faster. He moved to it slowly, like if he moved too fast, the moment would break and it would stop. The crackle came again, and underneath it he heard something else. A pattern. A rhythm. Like someone was sending a message. Tom's hands moved almost without him thinking about it. He started recording the pattern, scratching it into an old notebook with a pencil. When the pattern repeated for the 3rd time, he realized it wasn't random. It was coordinates. Actual coordinates. And woven through the static were words. Not clear, but there. His old translation software, the one he'd kept running on backup power all these years, started working. The words came together slowly. Come. That was the first word. Safety came next. Water. Tom's entire body went cold. Then hot. Then cold again. His mind raced through all the possibilities. It could be a malfunction. The solar panels could have gotten hit just right and caused some kind of feedback loop. That happened sometimes. His equipment was old and broken in 1,000 ways. It could be a phantom signal, bouncing off something in the atmosphere, some random cosmic noise that just happened to sound like words. Or it could be real. His hands started shaking as he packed his survival kit. He worked quickly, his brain already making decisions that his heart hadn't caught up to yet. Water bottle. Knife. First aid supplies. The jacket that kept him warm on cold nights. The map he'd drawn of this world based on 37 years of walking. He moved like someone possessed because part of him was. Hope was a dangerous thing. He'd learned that a long time ago. But he also knew that he had nothing left to lose. Tom had walked through deserts before, but never like this. Never with hope burning in his chest like a fire that could kill him just as easily as it could save him. He'd left his shelter 3 days ago, and the planet was already showing him that mercy was not something Kepler 442b understood. The dust storm hit on the second day. It came from nowhere, the way everything came from nowhere on this dead world. One moment the sky was just its usual dull brown, and the next moment it was alive with rage. Sand moved like water, thick and choking, and Tom wrapped the cloth around his face until he could barely breathe. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. His body wanted to stop, to find shelter and wait it out. His mind told him to keep moving. He kept moving. The pain in his joints screamed at him. Tom was not a young man anymore. His knees hurt. His hips hurt. His lower back felt like someone had driven nails through it. Every step was a negotiation between what his body wanted to do and what his will demanded. Stop. Rest. You're too old for this. That voice in his head sounded almost reasonable. It sounded like the voice of a civilized man, a man who understood that there were limits to what a body could do. That voice told him he should go back to his shelter and wait to die there, like a reasonable person would. Tom ignored that voice the way he'd been ignoring it for 37 years. He was different now. The planet had changed him. His muscles weren't the soft muscles of someone who'd grown up in a city or a colony dome. They were hard and lean, built from decades of hauling water, carrying supplies, digging, climbing, surviving. They were muscles that remembered how to work past pain, past exhaustion, past the point where a normal person would have collapsed. A soft person, a civilized person, would have died in that dust storm. Tom pushed through it, blind and choking because giving up was just another way of dying, and he'd already decided a long time ago that he wouldn't do that. By the fourth day, when the storm finally cleared, Tom found something that made him stop walking for the first time since he'd started. Ruins. They rose out of the sand like teeth, structures made of metal that had been corroded by time into something that looked almost organic. Some pieces were buried, others jutted out at angles that didn't make sense. Tom approached them slowly, his mind trying to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't human. He knew human structures. He'd lived in one for 2 years after the crash. These were different. Completely different. The metal had markings on it. Geometric patterns. Symbols that repeated in ways that suggested meaning. Not random. Intentional. Some intelligence had built these structures with a purpose. And they'd been here for a very, very long time. The corrosion alone suggested centuries. Maybe longer. Tom knelt down and started collecting pieces. Small fragments mostly. A metal sheet with symbols etched into it. A curved piece that might have been part of something larger. A stone that had writing on it, though the writing was worn nearly smooth by time and wind and sand. He packed them carefully into his bag, his fingers moving with the reverence of an archaeologist who just found proof of history. That night, he sat by his small fire and studied the fragments under the starlight. The stars here were different from Earth's stars. He'd memorized them all over the decades, learned to navigate by them, learned their patterns. Now, looking at these artifacts, he felt like the ground itself was speaking to him. This planet wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Something intelligent had lived here once. Something advanced enough to work with metals and design structures and create meaning. And then they were gone. They'd built and survived and then they'd fallen, leaving nothing behind but these corroding monuments to their existence. The signal was still there, still pulling him forward. Tom checked the direction against his map. The coordinates were real. Whoever, or whatever, was sending that signal was not broken equipment. This was intentional. This was someone calling to him across the vast, empty landscape. Or something. He thought about turning back. The fear crept in during those quiet hours before dawn, when the planet was coldest and most hostile. What if the signal wasn't rescue? What if it was something dangerous? What if the ruins were a warning, not an invitation? What if some ancient intelligence was still here, still waiting, and he was walking directly toward his own death? But Tom had spent 37 years alone, watching the water supply get lower every day, knowing that eventually he would die in that shelter. This signal was different. This was a chance, even if it was a small one. Even if it was dangerous. A small chance was better than no chance at all. So he packed up his fragments and his supplies and he kept walking. The landscape slowly changed as he moved forward. The endless flat plains gave way to areas with more rocky outcrops. He found more ruins, more fragments of whatever civilization had existed here before. Each piece was a clue, leading him forward, pulling him deeper into the mystery. His body was breaking down with each step, his water supply was dropping, and he didn't know what he would find when he finally reached his destination. But for the first time in 37 years, Tom had something to find. And that made all the difference. Tom saw it first as a shimmer on the horizon, something that didn't belong in the endless red and brown landscape. His mind tried to tell him it was a mirage, another trick that the desert played on people who'd been alone too long. But as he got closer, the shimmer became solid. Real. Impossible but real. The domes rose out of the ground like metal bubbles, smooth and perfect in a way that nothing on this planet should be. Inside them he could see green. Actual green. Plants growing under artificial light, organized in rows, thriving. And around the domes, structures that looked like they'd been built yesterday, not decades ago. Everything was clean. Everything was maintained. Everything spoke of people who had resources, who had time, who had hope. Tom stopped about 100 meters away. His legs wouldn't move anymore. His body had carried him for 9 days through a landscape designed to kill, and now that he'd found what he was looking for, it wouldn't go any further. He stood there, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, watching the colony like it might disappear if he blinked. Then the doors opened. People came out. Real people. Tom's mind struggled to process it. He'd spent so long alone that the sight of other humans was almost painful. They moved differently than he remembered people moving. They had softness to them. Their clothes were clean. Their skin wasn't weathered and cracked from constant sun exposure. They looked like people from a world that still had hope. A woman walked toward him first. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a neat braid, and her eyes were scanning him the way a scientist scans an interesting specimen under a microscope. Her name was Elena, though Tom didn't know that yet. She stopped a few meters away, maintaining distance like she wasn't sure if he was safe. "How are you alive?" she asked. Tom opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He'd spent 37 years mostly alone, occasionally talking to himself just to hear a voice. Actual conversation with another person looking at him with actual curiosity, it was too much. His throat felt tight. His mind felt like it was moving through water, slow and heavy. Behind Elena, more people emerged from the colony. Tom counted them without meaning to. 12, 15, more. Some wore uniforms that suggested military training. Others had the bearing of engineers or scientists. They all looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, like they were trying to figure out whether he was a resource or a threat. An older man stepped forward, moving with the kind of authority that came from leadership. His name was Frank, and even though Tom didn't know it yet, he could feel it. This was the person in charge. This was the one who made decisions about whether strangers lived or died. "What's your name?" Frank asked. His voice was calm and professional, but Tom could hear the calculation underneath it. This man was trying to figure out what to do with him. "Tom," he managed to say. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough and unused. "My name is Tom." Frank nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about something. Then he said, "Bring him inside." Carefully. The next thing Tom knew, hands were guiding him forward. Not rough, not threatening, just firm and sure. He was led through the dome opening and the temperature changed immediately. Cool air hit his face. Real air, not the thin, scorched atmosphere of the outside. His eyes watered. Inside, everything was overwhelming. The green plants, the lights, the smooth metal walls, the equipment humming quietly in the background. It was like stepping into a dream of civilization. A small dream, maybe, a tiny pocket of humanity clinging to existence on this dead world. But a dream nonetheless. They brought him to a room that was clean and climate-controlled. Someone offered him a seat. Tom sat down carefully, like the chair might break under his weight. His body was shaking, though he wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or emotion or something else entirely. Then Elena came back with water. It was in a clean cup. Clear. Cool. Tom stared at it like it was something holy. He lifted it to his lips slowly and drank. The taste hit him like a memory. Water. Real, clean water. Not the brackish stuff he'd been drinking for years, filtered through sand and rocks and whatever he could manage. This was water that tasted like possibility, like life. But as he drank, he realized something. He'd spent 37 years alone, and his mind had learned to work that way. It had learned to think in silence, to move without consideration for others, to make decisions based purely on survival. Now he was surrounded by people and he couldn't remember how to be around them. He couldn't remember how to stand without flinching. Couldn't remember how to make eye contact. Couldn't remember what it felt like to not be afraid. Elena was still watching him, that same scientific curiosity in her eyes. Frank was somewhere in the background, talking quietly with the other colonists, probably deciding what to do with this stranger who'd walked out of the desert. Tom drank the water and tried to remember how to be human again. The test started the next morning. Tom woke up in a clean bed, something he hadn't slept in for decades, and immediately felt wrong. The mattress was too soft. The room was too quiet. There were no sounds of wind or distant animal calls. Just silence and climate control and the hum of machines he couldn't see. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Elena came to get him after breakfast. She had a tablet in her hands, the kind of technology that Tom had only read about in old files from before the crash. She smiled, but it was a professional smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to run some tests," she said. "Just to make sure you're healthy. And to understand your situation better." The tests were thorough. Physical examinations first. A doctor named Raymond checked every inch of Tom's body, making notes on his tablet, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or concern. Tom's blood pressure was too high. His bone density was lower than it should be. He had scars all over his body from old injuries that had healed wrong because there was no one to set them properly. His muscle composition was unusual, lean and efficient in ways that normal human muscles weren't supposed to be. "How did you survive with these conditions?" Raymond asked, genuinely confused. "I didn't have a choice," Tom said. "You survive or you die. There's nothing in between." The psychological evaluations were worse than the physical ones. They brought him to a small room with a table and a chair, and a different person, a woman named Dr. Keisha, sat across from him with more tablets and more questions. She asked about his childhood, his family, his emotional state over the 37 years. She asked about suicidal thoughts, about hallucinations, about whether he'd ever considered giving up. Tom answered most of the questions. But some of them didn't have answers that made sense. How do you explain to someone from a functioning society that you've spent nearly 4 decades alone on a dead planet and mostly you just tried not to think about it? How do you make them understand that the human mind is capable of shutting down entire sections of itself to keep functioning? Dr. Keisha made notes constantly, her expression growing more troubled. "You show signs of significant trauma," she said finally. "Emotional detachment. Reduced affect. Possible dissociation. We should begin therapy." Tom almost laughed. Therapy. As if talking about his problems could change anything. But the real tests came when Frank introduced him to the colony's operations center. It was a vast room filled with screens and equipment and data streams. Everything was connected to an artificial intelligence system that the colonists called Atlas. Atlas controlled everything. Water distribution, power allocation, temperature regulation, food production, even security. The AI predicted problems before they happened and allocated resources to prevent them. The entire colony ran on calculations and optimization algorithms. A young engineer named Riley was assigned to show Tom around. She was brilliant and restless, the kind of person who'd been born into a world with all the answers already provided by machines. She walked him through the systems with obvious pride, explaining how everything was connected, how nothing was left to chance. "This is how we survive," Riley said, gesturing at the massive network of data. "We let the systems do what they're designed to do. We trust the algorithms. We follow the protocols." Tom stood there watching data flow across screens, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't survival. This was the opposite of survival. This was people who'd never had to truly struggle, never had to make impossible choices, never had to trust their own instincts over everything else. "What happens when the system fails?" he asked. Riley looked at him like he'd asked something ridiculous. "It doesn't fail. We have backups. We have predictive models. We anticipate problems. Everything fails eventually," Tom said quietly. Word got around fast. Riley told other people what he'd said. Some colonists found it interesting, this strange old man who questioned the systems they'd built their entire lives around. Others found it threatening. Arguments broke out in the cafeteria and the work areas. Was Tom a valuable addition, a person who'd survived the impossible? Or was he a liability, someone who didn't understand the importance of following established procedures? The colony split down the middle. Elena was in the camp that saw potential in him. She started spending time with Tom, asking about his survival methods, his decision-making process, the way he'd learned to read the planet. She was fascinated and horrified in equal measure, like she was looking at something that shouldn't exist but somehow did. "You lived without our systems," she said one evening. "Without safety protocols. Without backup plans. Without anything but your own judgment." "How?" "I lived because I had to," Tom replied. "You live because you think you have to. Those are different things. When you have to survive, you become something different. Something harder. You trust yourself because there's no one else to trust. But you're here now," Elena said. "You don't have to be that way anymore." Tom didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know how to be any other way. Then, 3 weeks after Tom arrived, the monitors started showing something wrong. Deep underground, the seismic sensors detected tremors. Small ones at first, barely noticeable. But they kept coming. Frank called an emergency meeting with the engineering team. Atlas analyzed the data and produced its prediction. The tremors were natural geological activity, probably minor, probably nothing to worry about. The predictive models showed a 97% certainty that this was stable. But Tom, standing in the back of the room, remembered the ruins he'd found in the desert. Structures that had been built by an advanced civilization, structures that had crumbled and fallen. He remembered the ancient chamber he'd passed on his pilgrimage, the way the ground had felt wrong there, unstable. He thought about what Elena had asked him. How had he survived? By reading the world. By trusting patterns he couldn't fully explain. By understanding that sometimes your gut feeling was more reliable than any machine. Something's wrong, he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. Frank's expression was unreadable. Atlas had already made its calculations. The machines had already spoken. But the tremors kept coming, getting stronger. It happened faster than anyone expected. 3 days after Tom's warning, the first tunnel collapsed. Not a small section. An entire support structure that had been built to withstand anything the planet could throw at it simply gave way, bringing down part of the water distribution system with it. People were hurt. Equipment was destroyed. For the first time since the colony had been established, something had happened that Atlas hadn't predicted. Frank called an emergency meeting. Atlas ran its analysis again and again, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The AI generated new models, adjusted its calculations, recalibrated its sensors. Everything came back the same. This shouldn't be happening. According to the machines, the geological stability of the planet was sound. The tremors were minor. The infrastructure was secure. But the planet wasn't listening to the machines. Over the next week, the situation got worse. More tunnels showed stress fractures. The ground beneath the main dome developed cracks that spread like veins. Power systems started failing in cascading sequences. One system would go down, overloading the next system, which would fail and take down another one. It was like watching dominoes fall, except these dominoes were the foundation of everything the colony had built. People started to panic. The colonists had never faced a crisis that their technology couldn't solve. They'd grown up believing that problems had solutions in databases, that answers could be found in algorithms, that machines would always have an answer. Now they were watching those machines fail and they were terrified. Elena found Tom in one of the residential modules. He was studying the geological data on a tablet, not the cleaned-up version that Atlas provided, but the raw sensor information. He was drawing patterns on paper, marking things that didn't match the AI's models. "We're running out of time," she said. "Frank wants to evacuate. We're going to abandon the colony and try to make it to the emergency bunkers on the northern continent. But we might not have enough supplies. We might not make it." Tom looked up from his work. His eyes were clearer than they'd been since he arrived. This was the world he understood. Crisis. Impossible choices. Survival against the odds. The old civilization didn't leave, he said. They built something to survive here. To work with the planet, not against it. "What are you talking about?" "The ruins. The chambers I found in the desert. They're not random. They're positioned at specific geological points. The ancients understood something about this planet that we don't. They built their entire civilization based on that understanding. And when they failed, it wasn't because they didn't have technology. It was because they stopped listening to the planet and started trusting only their machines." Elena stared at him. "You think the answer is down there? In the deep sections?" "I know it is," Tom said. "But Atlas won't let anyone go there. The AI considers it too dangerous. It's already told Frank that venturing into the unmapped sections would likely result in death." "So what do we do?" Tom stood up. For the first time since arriving at the colony, he looked like the person who'd survived 37 years alone. Certain. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with absolute commitment. "We go anyway," he said. It took some convincing, but Elena believed him. She brought Riley with her, the young engineer who'd shown him the AI systems. Riley was terrified, but she was also the kind of person who understood that sometimes the rules had to be broken. The three of them gathered supplies and descended into the deep sections of the colony, places that had never been fully mapped because Atlas had calculated that they weren't necessary. The deeper they went, the older the structures became. They found chambers that weren't part of the colony's construction. Chambers that predated human arrival by thousands of years. Ancient technology, corroded and worn but still showing signs of sophistication that matched what Tom had seen in the desert ruins. Tom moved through the ancient sections like he was reading a language written in stone and metal. He stopped at certain points, studying the walls, tracing patterns that made sense only to someone who'd spent decades learning to read an alien landscape. Elena followed, documenting everything on her tablet. Riley tried to understand the technology, but it was so old and so different that her modern knowledge was almost useless. Then Tom found it. A chamber deeper than the others, carved directly into solid rock. Inside, the walls were covered with markings. Not random markings but organized, systematic. Geometric patterns that repeated in ways that suggested mathematical precision. Tom traced them with his fingers and his mind put together the puzzle. It was a map. A geological map of the planet's interior. And it showed something that Atlas's modern sensors had missed. The planet's deep structure was unstable but not randomly so. The instability followed patterns. Pressure points. Weak zones that moved and shifted in cycles. The ancient civilization had built their structures to accommodate this movement, to flex with it rather than resist it. The colony had built rigid structures. Structures that refused to bend. And the planet was punishing them for it. "We need to redistribute the weight," Tom said, his mind already calculating, already seeing the solution. "We need to shift the foundation points, move the main dome, reinforce the secondary tunnels. We need to work with the planet's movement, not against it." Riley was already documenting the ancient blueprints on her tablet. "If we can translate these patterns, if we can understand the cycle." "We don't have time to understand everything," Tom interrupted. "We have time to survive. That's all we've ever had time for." They emerged from the deep sections with the ancient maps and Elena's documentation. Tom brought them straight to Frank. The colony leader was in the operations center, preparing evacuation protocols, accepting that they'd failed. Tom spread out the information. He explained what he'd found. He showed the patterns. He demonstrated how the ancient civilization had survived on this planet for millennia by learning to read its moods and move with its rhythms instead of against them. Frank looked at the data. He looked at Atlas, which was still predicting failure, still telling them evacuation was the only option. Then he looked at Tom. "How do you know this will work?" Frank asked. "I don't," Tom said honestly. "But I know that everything else is failing. And I know how to survive when everything fails." Frank made a decision. He called together the engineering team. He told them to ignore Atlas's recommendations. He told them to follow Tom's instructions. Some of the engineers protested. Others hesitated. But Elena stepped forward. "I've seen what Tom can do," she said. "I've seen how he reads problems that machines can't solve. We can trust him." They worked through the night. They repositioned support structures. They shifted weight distribution. They reinforced tunnels according to patterns that Tom had seen in ancient stone. Riley translated the old blueprints as fast as she could, feeding information to the work teams. Elena coordinated between the engineers and Tom, making sure his vision was understood and executed. The tremors continued. More sections failed. But the colony held together. It shifted. It adapted. Like the ancient structures in the desert, like the chambers deep underground, the colony learned to move with the planet instead of fighting it. By dawn, the tremors stopped. The geological stress began to dissipate. Atlas ran its analysis and finally reported something new: stability. Not the kind of stable that the machines had promised before, but a real, earned stability. A stability that came from understanding how to survive in a difficult place. The colony gathered in the main dome as the sun rose over Kepler 442b's red horizon. Frank stood before them and he made an announcement. "We're going to change how we operate," he said. "Technology will remain important. We need our machines. We need our systems. But we're also going to preserve and protect something else. We're going to remember that there's a kind of knowledge that can't be programmed into a machine. A kind of wisdom that comes from real survival. From people like Tom, who learn to read a world that doesn't want to be understood." He looked directly at Tom. "We're going to create a new position. Advisory Council for Adaptive Survival. Your job will be to teach us what you know. To make sure we never forget that humans are capable of more than our machines calculate." Tom nodded slowly. He still didn't know how to stand among people without some part of him being tense and ready to fight. He still didn't know how to relax completely. The desert had changed him in ways that couldn't be reversed. But he also knew that he would never be completely alone again. Elena approached him after the gathering broke up. She was smiling, genuinely this time, not the professional smile of someone running tests. "You saved us," she said. "You saved the entire colony." Tom shook his head. "I just survived. That's all I've ever known how to do. I'm glad it was useful. More than useful. You proved something important. You proved that we need both. We need machines and systems and technology. But we also need people who can think beyond algorithms. We need human instinct. We need the kind of wisdom that only comes from truly struggling." Over the following weeks, things slowly changed in the colony. Tom began training groups of engineers and scientists in what he called planetary reading, the practice of observing patterns, trusting intuition, making decisions based on incomplete information and experience rather than just data. Some colonists embraced it. Others resisted, uncomfortable with the idea that machines weren't always right. But Riley became Tom's most dedicated student. She spent hours with him, learning to see patterns in geological data that Atlas had dismissed as noise. She started to understand that technology and intuition weren't opposites, they were partners. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the Kepler 442b sky in shades of orange and red, Riley asked Tom a question. "Do you miss it? Being alone?" Tom thought about that for a long time. He thought about the silence, the absolute self-reliance, the knowing that every decision was his and his alone to make. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but missing something doesn't mean it was better. I survived alone because I had to. Now I'm here because I chose to be. That's different. That's better, even if it's harder." "Will you ever leave?" Riley asked. "Now that you know other people exist again?" Tom looked out at the red desert stretching beyond the colony domes. He thought about the ruins he'd walked past, the ancient chambers he'd explored, the signal that had called him out of the wasteland. "No," he said finally. "I'm done walking. I found what I was looking for. Not just water or safety, but a place where survival means something. Where it matters. I'm going to stay and help make sure this colony survives. Really survives. Not just exists on borrowed time and perfect models, but survives by understanding this world and learning to live within it." The colony continued to adapt and grow. They maintained their technology but tempered it with the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned to survive against impossible odds. They created systems that could flex and adjust, that could listen to the planet as well as calculate its movements. And Tom, who'd spent 37 years alone on an abandoned world, finally found something more valuable than survival itself. He found purpose. He found community. He found the understanding that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in its machines or its calculations. It was in its ability to refuse to quit, to keep moving forward, to adapt, to survive, to transform survival into something meaningful. The signal that had called him from the desert had led him exactly where he needed to be.